Welcome back to The Great American Headfake, a series that examines how power maintains itself, not just through force or wealth, but through illusion. In this project, we're dissecting how the American people, particularly the working class, were led away from solidarity and structural critique, and toward division, distraction, and despair. This isn't a story about partisan politics. It's a story about sleight of hand, about how narratives are constructed, identities are weaponized, and how entire populations can be convinced to vote, protest, and even fight against their own material interests. In the first part, we explored the foundational bait and switch, how the post-war consensus around shared prosperity slowly gave way to deregulation, privatization, and the erosion of the New Deal social contract, all under the banner of market freedom and individual responsibility. Today, we turn to the next phase in this illusion, how culture, specifically deeply emotional symbols like religion, firearms, and patriotism, were enlisted to seal the deal. This episode is about how the language of God, the imagery of guns, and the spectacle of flag-waving nationalism were strategically amplified, not just to stir the soul, but to suffocate economic awareness. We'll examine how legitimate concerns over faith, rights, and identity were hijacked and transformed into a carefully engineered cultural battlefield, designed to keep the public perpetually distracted, while corporate interests quietly gutted the institutions that once protected workers, families, and communities. This wasn't an accident. It was a strategy, a long game. And if we want to understand how America became a place where people shout about freedom while drowning in debt, where workers mistrust unions but trust billionaires, and where every problem is framed as moral decay rather than material injustice, then we have to trace the roots of that confusion. Because behind every head fake, there's a truth worth seeing. And in this case, the truth is simple. Cultural warfare didn't just divide America, it concealed the looting. It starts in the South. Not just a place on the map, but as an idea. The South was a crucible of identity politics, historical trauma, and simmering resentment. And in the decades following World War II, it became the proving ground for a new kind of political warfare, cultural warfare. Up through the mid-20th century, the South had been a democratic stronghold, not because of any commitment to liberalism, but because of the party's long-standing tolerance for Jim Crow. This was the solid South, where white supremacy was built into the political architecture. Segregation wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system. But the 1960s changed everything. When the Democratic Party, under Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, finally began embracing civil rights, however imperfectly, the political ground began to shift. Johnson, upon signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is said to have muttered, "We have lost the South for a generation." He was wrong. It wasn't just one generation. It was more like 3, and counting. Enter the Southern strategy. The Republican Party, once the party of Lincoln and federal authority, saw an historic opportunity. If white Southern voters were feeling alienated by Democrats' newfound commitment to racial equality, someone else could offer them a political home, one where the racial hierarchy would remain intact, even if it had to be dressed up in new language. Open racism was becoming less acceptable in polite society. The cameras had seen the fire hoses and the dogs in Birmingham. The world had seen Bloody Sunday in Selma. So, instead of outright segregation, Republican operatives turned to coded language, what political scientists call dog whistles. States' rights, law and order, forced busing, welfare queens, inner-city crime. These phrases didn't explicitly mention race, but everyone knew what they meant. The message was clear. The world is changing. They're coming for your schools, your jobs, your neighborhoods. And only we can protect you. It wasn't about economics anymore, or rather it was, but no one would say that out loud. Because the truth was that many of these white voters were working class themselves. They, too, were vulnerable to the very same forces hollowing out American industry and shipping jobs overseas. But their outrage was steered elsewhere, away from corporate boardrooms and toward cultural scapegoats. The political genius of the Southern strategy wasn't just in flipping the South from blue to red. It was in nationalizing the strategy. What started as a regional realignment soon became a national cultural war. By the 1980s, the Southern strategy had gone mainstream. You didn't need a Southern accent to fear urban crime. You didn't need to fly the Confederate flag to resent affirmative action and food stamps. Suburbs across the country absorbed the same messages. That the real threat wasn't wage stagnation, but moral decline. The problem wasn't deindustrialization, but them. Those people over there, different from you, demanding things they hadn't earned. It worked. Millions of white working-class Americans in the South, the Midwest, even in the Union towns and the Rust Belt cities, began voting against their own economic interests, not because they loved deregulation or trickle-down theory, not because they wanted their Social Security privatized, but because they feared a world they no longer recognized. They feared integration. They feared changing gender roles. They feared the erosion of traditional values, or at least the nostalgic image of them. And most of all, they feared losing their place in a social hierarchy that had always seemed, to them, like the natural order of things. So, instead of organizing across class lines, they turned inward. They chose identity over solidarity, cultural grievance over economic justice. And once that turn was made, the rest became easy for the architects of the new right. The culture war had begun, not as a spontaneous uprising of concerned citizens, but as a deliberate strategy to divide and distract. And for those in power, it was a masterstroke. Because so long as people were fighting about race, religion, gender, or sexual orientation, they're not fighting about wages, healthcare, housing, and the ever-expanding chasm between the billionaires and everyone else. And once culture became the battlefield, the rules of engagement changed. The right had found its footing, not through policy, but identity. Not by solving problems, but by defining enemies. It wasn't just enough to stir up resentment. They needed to give it shape. So they built a hero, the God-fearing, gun-toting, self-reliant American, under siege from their own government. If the culture war was the fire, this myth was the fuel. While the culture war smoldered through the late 20th century, another myth was being carefully stoked, one that would become a pillar of American identity politics. The myth of the rugged individual. A man alone, with a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other, answerable to no one, dependent on nothing but grit, God, and firepower. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a campaign. At the center of it stood the National Rifle Association. Once upon a time, the NRA was a relatively apolitical organization. It focused on sportsmanship, gun safety, and responsible ownership. For decades, it even supported gun control measures like background checks and restrictions on certain weapons. But starting in the 1970s, and especially after the hard right takeover at the 1977 Cincinnati Revolt, the NRA transformed into something else entirely. A political powerhouse aligned with the Republican Party and the growing new right. Gone was the language of public safety. In its place came something far more provocative. Guns equal freedom. Government equals tyranny. Owning a gun was no longer just about hunting or hobby. It was a moral imperative, a symbol of resistance against creeping authoritarianism, liberal overreach, and the imagined specter of a socialist state. This was never really about the Second Amendment. It was about redefining freedom itself, not as a collective liberty secured by law and infrastructure, but as individual firepower in a hostile world. If you can convince people that the government is inherently suspect, that every regulation is an overreach, every tax is a theft, every program a threat, then you don't need to fight unions head on. You've already eroded the very idea of collective power. Why fight for fair wages when you can just buy a bigger gun and stand your ground? And while they were at it, the architects of this movement fused gun culture with something even more powerful: religion. Starting in the late 1970s and accelerating under Reagan, evangelical Christianity, once hesitant to mix too deeply with politics, became deeply entangled with the conservative movement. The Moral Majority, founded by Jerry Falwell in 1979, provided the blueprint: merge Christian identity with conservative ideology and turn every political issue into a spiritual war. Now, it wasn't just about small government. It was about God's will. Public services became handouts. Social justice became socialism. Unions became secular threats. And poverty? That was no longer seen as a policy failure. It was a personal failing, a lack of faith or discipline. So, even as millions of Americans lost their jobs to offshoring and automation, even as real wages stagnated and healthcare costs soared, the national conversation turned elsewhere. The real crisis, they were told, wasn't economic. It was moral. Gays getting married, women having abortions, kids not praying in schools. You could be one paycheck away from eviction, but as long as someone, somewhere, was burning a flag or saying Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas, you had a reason to stay angry. This was the brilliant, if brutal, pivot. Economic discontent was recast as cultural resentment. Solidarity was replaced with suspicion. And every call for collective uplift was branded as a Trojan horse for tyranny. This new American identity, armed, evangelical, and antagonistic toward government, became one of the most potent political forces in the country. It redefined patriotism not as civic participation, but as cultural purity. And it offered millions of people a seductive message. You don't need help. You don't need community. You just need faith and firepower. And if you're suffering, well, maybe that's just how God tests righteousness. But while they told you to stand tall as an individual, behind the curtain, they were tearing down the only institutions that had ever empowered people collectively. They sold you freedom with one hand and quietly stole your bargaining power with the other, because nothing threatens concentrated power more than a united working class. And so, while you were arguing about who could marry whom, they went after the one thing that could still say no to unchecked greed: the unions. While the headlines screamed about prayer in schools and the right to bear arms, a quieter war was unfolding, not on morality, but on solidarity. Because if you really want to consolidate power, it's not enough to distract. You have to disarm. And the most dangerous weapon the working class ever had: the labor union. For most of the 20th century, unions were the spine of the American economic life. They weren't perfect, far from it. Some had serious problems with racism, sexism, even corruption. But they worked. They worked because they forced a seat at the table. They worked because they created a counterweight to corporate greed. And they worked because they reminded workers that their strength didn't come from rugged individualism. It came from standing shoulder to shoulder. In their heyday, unions lifted millions of the middle class. They turned dangerous, low-paying jobs into careers. They negotiated pensions, health care, job security, things we now think of as luxuries, but that used to be standard. They gave working people not just a paycheck, but a voice. And that made them a threat, not to America, but to the people running it. So the knives came out, not all at once, and not always directly. This wasn't a coup. This was a slow bleed. In the 1970s, corporate America got nervous. Profit margins were tightening, global competition was rising, and unions, especially in manufacturing, weren't backing down. Enter a new class of political operatives, think tanks and right-wing economists, with one shared goal: break the unions. They didn't say that outright. They talked about labor flexibility. They talked about modernization. They talked about the free market. And people listened, especially when the economy hit the skids. When inflation spiked and jobs started vanishing, it wasn't corporate policy that got blamed. It was the unions. They were too demanding, too inflexible. They were hurting the economy. They were bad for business. By the 1980s, that narrative was gospel. Ronald Reagan didn't just feed the myth. He institutionalized it. One of his first acts in office was to fire the striking air traffic controllers in the PATCO union. It was a seismic moment, not just because of what he did, but who was watching. CEOs got the message. If the president could crush a union on national TV, well, so could they. And they did. In industry after industry, company after company, steel, coal, autos, textile, retail. Strikes were broken, contracts were gutted, pensions were frozen, factories were moved, first to the non-union South, then overseas. And where the government didn't act directly, they stepped aside. The National Labor Relations Board, once the referee in labor disputes, was packed with corporate shills. Union protections were weakened. Enforcement dried up. Suddenly, it was legal to fire people for organizing, to stall contract negotiations for years, to intimidate workers as long as you didn't use the wrong words. But here's the thing. None of this would have worked if the public had been paying attention. So they made sure that we weren't. As the unions were bleeding out, the airwaves were filling up with moral panic. Drag queens, immigrants, flag burners, feminists, atheists. Anything to keep workers from asking, why can't I afford to live anymore? What happened to my benefits? Where did my job go? Because if you could train the working class to see every social movement as a threat, if you could teach them to associate unions with socialism, if you could convince them that their neighbor was the problem, not their boss, then you didn't need to defeat labor with tanks. You could do it with talk radio. By the 1990s, union membership in the private sector had collapsed to single digits. The industries that had once formed the backbone of American prosperity were now hollowed out, their protections gone. But the flag still waved, the rhetoric still soared, and the dream, the myth, of individual strength was stronger than ever. Even as the safety net unraveled, people still said, I don't need a union, I just need to work harder. If you're poor, that's your fault. This is America. We don't need handouts. By the time most people realized what they'd lost, it was already gone. And just like that, the labor movement, once the beating heart of working class power, was on life support. But even that wasn't enough. But gutting unions didn't just require new laws. It required new myths. Stories that told workers their suffering wasn't betrayal, but patriotism. That low wages were freedom. That deregulation was American. That fighting for better conditions made you a whiner, not a hero. So they didn't just break the unions. They wrapped the wreckage in red, white, and blue. If culture was the spark and guns and God were the accelerant, then this was the real arson, the dismantling of organized labor. Quiet, surgical, devastating. Because for all the noise about family values and the war on Christmas, the real war was on workers. And the greatest threat to unchecked corporate power wasn't communism or secularism. It was solidarity. In the mid-20th century, unions were the bedrock of the American middle class. They didn't just demand better wages or safer working conditions. They demanded dignity. Weekends, pensions, health insurance, the 40-hour work week. These weren't gifts from benevolent bosses. They were hard-won victories, bargained and battled for by working people who understood one thing. Alone, you are replaceable. Together, you are powerful. At their peak in the 1950s and 60s, union membership in the private sector hovered around 35%. Entire communities, especially in the industrial heartland, were built on labor solidarity. Wages were livable, homes were affordable, and a single income could support a family. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't equitable, but it was stable, and it was earned. Then came the 1980s. Ronald Reagan entered office with a smile and a script: small government, free markets, and the mythology of personal responsibility. The messaging was expertly wrapped in Americana, soaring flags, cowboy charm, and that eternal mantra: government isn't the solution, government is the problem. It was a lie, but it was a comforting one. And it gave cover to a brutal economic agenda. One of Reagan's first major acts as president was to fire over 11,000 air traffic controllers, members of the PATCO union, who had gone on strike for better working conditions. The message was crystal clear. The federal government would no longer back labor. And if they wouldn't back labor for federal workers, they sure as hell wouldn't back factory workers in Michigan or miners in West Virginia. Over the next few decades, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, unions were slowly and systematically defanged. Right-to-work laws, which sound like guarantees but are actually union-busting tools, spread across state legislatures. NAFTA and other trade agreements encouraged offshoring. Deregulation and antitrust rollback allowed megacorporations to consolidate power. The justifications were always dressed in patriotic language. Unions were greedy. They made us less competitive. They were full of corruption. They were un-American. And people bought it, or rather, they were sold it. Because while CEOs saw their pay explode over 1,000% and productivity skyrocketed, the average American worker saw wages stagnate or even decline in real terms. Entire towns were hollowed out, pensions disappeared, benefits evaporated, but somehow the anger never quite made it to the boardrooms. Why? Because by the time workers began to feel the knife in their backs, they had already been taught to blame someone else. The culture war, that relentless churn of outrage and moral panic, provided endless scapegoats. Liberals were trying to cancel Christmas. Immigrants were trying to take your jobs. Women were leaving the home. Atheists were attacking your values. Minorities were getting special treatment. The working class was taught to punch sideways or down, never up. Never toward the CEOs writing policies over golf, or to lobbyists drafting legislation on K Street. So the unions died, not with a bang, but with a branding campaign. And the working class? They were left with longer hours, lower wages, and fewer protections, but plenty of flags to wave and enemies to fear. Wrapped in the flag, stabbed in the back, and told to thank the man holding the knife. God, guns, and red, white, and blue righteousness. These weren't just ideas. They were identity, a shield against fear, a story to explain the struggle. The gospel of the individual was comforting. You didn't need a union, a safety net, or a system that worked. You just needed faith, firepower, and freedom. But none of it stopped your town from collapsing. None of it kept your job from being automated, outsourced, or replaced by a gig with no benefits. You were told it was someone else's fault. Immigrants, feminists, the coastal elite. You were taught to fear your neighbor more than your boss. And while the culture war raged, the class war was won. Quietly, efficiently, and from the boardroom. This was the head fake. Keep people angry. Keep them divided. Keep them fighting each other over bathrooms, books, and flags. While pensions disappeared, wages stagnated, and wealth flowed upward at historic speed, all under the illusion that you were free. Because here's the thing about lies. Eventually, the mask slips, and more people are starting to ask uncomfortable questions. So, the next time someone tells you the real problem is woke culture, or that unions are anti-American, or that billionaires are just job creators, ask them this: who gets rich while we fight each other? And more importantly, what would happen if we stopped?